Welcome to a quick discussion of Metroid Prime Remastered. This is a graphical overhaul of one of the highest reviewed Nintendo games of all time, so I wanted to quickly highlight some of the changes and improvements in this version. When Metroid Prime released in 2002, it was actually a big deal. It not only took a beloved 2D series and made it 3D, it also made it first person. To be honest, even as someone who's not a big fan of first-person games, I've always liked the Prime games because they still keep the spirit of exploration from the 2D entries. This is actually the second major re-release of this game. The first was through the new Play Control line for the Wii in Japan, and through the Trilogy Collection in the West. Metroid Prime Remastered is heavily based specifically on the Wii version. So for example, you can actually use the spring ball by shaking the controller, or in some controller configurations, you can also press X. Speaking of which, this version actually includes quite a few controller options. For example, we have a classic controller setup, which is based on the GameCube version. Unfortunately, you actually can't play this entirely with a GameCube controller with the adapter with Smash Bros. Because there's no way to swap minus and plus, so you won't be able to pause the game and access the options menu. You can swap X and Y, and also map the map button to R or ZR to further replicate the original control setup, but again, it does feel like a major oversight not being able to switch minus and plus. We also have a couple of other options as well. There's a hybrid mode that's basically the classic controller option, but you can also use motion controls with it. There's pointer controls with Joy-Cons, similar to in Metroid Prime Trilogy for the Wii. I personally haven't tried this, but I'm not really a big fan of gyro aiming in a lot of these games because of having to reset the gyro controls a lot because there's no sensor bar for the Switch. Finally, we have a dual-stick option, which is my preferred way to play this game. This makes it play a lot more like a traditional first-person shooter, where you can simply use the right control stick to aim. You can also use ZR to fire. One major change on the subject is when you charge up a charge shot, you might notice that it fires 3 shots instead of 1. It's generally believed to make it easier to fire multiple shots with ZR, given that mashing the trigger might get uncomfortable after a while. From what I gather though, they've actually adjusted the charge speed, so even though you fire 3 shots first, it still charges in about the same amount of time. Along with the controller changes, the obvious main improvement is to the visuals. To be honest, in some ways, it almost speaks more for how well Metroid Prime on GameCube has aged. Obviously, a lot of work has gone to updating the lighting and textures of everything, but the core design is still mostly intact. In general, I think this is a fantastic remaster because it actually does retain a lot of the original spirit of the GameCube version. But again, that's almost more of a testament to how well the GameCube version has aged and how absolutely stunning it looked back in 2002. I still think, despite being close to launch, it might be one of the best looking GameCube games of all time. In general, I definitely feel like there are a couple of issues though, and even though for the most part the game looks phenomenal, there have been some complaints about some changes, for example, how the doors look, and how basically the lighting of the doors is layered over it, which doesn't look accurate to how it looked in the GameCube version. There's also some small issues with pop-in occasionally and loading times, but in general, this is a fantastic way to play the game. Like other games that have gone from Wii, for example, to Switch, I almost feel like the controller improvements are actually a bigger deal for me than the graphical overhaul. Because again, Metroid Prime has always looked spectacular. But being able to actually play this game with a more traditional control setup is actually really nice, and definitely makes certain sections a lot easier. It's also nice being able to play a modern version, one, without having to hook up my Wii U every time I want to play it, and also without having to use motion controls. But again, I do like how they have the option for motion controls if you'd prefer that. Again, going through the early parts of the Talon 4 overworld, it's just kind of amazing how this game looks. From what I gather, it doesn't run at a full 1080p, it's closer to 1600 by 900, but honestly, I also feel like this might be one of the best looking games on Switch as well, because of how much work has gone into updating this. This game is truly impressive, and it definitely exceeded my expectations when I first saw this when it was announced at the February 2023 Nintendo Direct. A remaster of this game had been rumored for ages in various forms. Going all the way back to 2018 even, there were rumors of a trilogy port, and basically rumors persisted ever since. Over time, clarifications were made that it would be just a remaster of the first game, but it would be a lot more drastic than a simple port. Basically, it was rumored to have been finished a very long time ago, and only showed up recently at a Direct. It was also dropped the same day as that Direct, though the physical release was released a bit later, and personally, as someone who likes to collect games, I did wait for the physical release, which was actually out of stock for a really long time. By the time I got my copy, I was already invested in other games, so I only recently started playing through Prime Remastered, and honestly, it's been a treat. It reminds me of how good this game has aged, despite being over 20 years old at this point. There are definitely some aged elements like no autosaving, not being able to pin anything on your map, essentially, not automatically marking things on your map as well, because a lot of times it's very easy to lose track of what you have and haven't collected. Even with a guide, I feel like the Metroid Prime games can be a little bit annoying in that regard. So I do wish there had been some other quality of life improvements other than just visual improvements and also improvements to the controls, but in general, this is a very faithful version of the game, specifically the Wii version. It's also worth mentioning that certain glitches were removed in the new Play Control version, and that still applies here, but a lot of tricks in the Wii version still actually work in the Trilogy version. To show off another area, let's head to the Magmoor Caverns. Again, I'm just kind of amazed at how good this game turned out. This was made by Retro actually, along with some other support studios, most notably Iron Galaxy. I definitely feel like that's part of the reason why we haven't seen anything from Prime 4 in a very long time. Prime 4 was announced to be rebooting development in 2019. My theory is that Retro was still working on this remaster at the time, and so the actual work on Prime 4 didn't really start until much more recently than the original 2019 announcement. I still hope it's coming out soon though, given I'm really curious to see what they do with it, both from a visual standpoint after how good this looks, just building off of an existing game, and also how the overall structuring works, given that the Metroidvania genre has evolved quite a bit over the last 20 years or so. It definitely feels like we also don't have many 3D Metroidvanias in general, so I'm also curious to see how this works out. But again, I have a feeling it'll be a while until we see Prime 4. I'd love to be proven wrong though, because I am very curious. Of the trilogy, I actually don't know which is my favorite. I think Prime 4 is the best in terms of being the most well-rounded game. I do have a soft spot for the other two though. I actually do like Echoes and Corruption quite a bit, even though I admit that both have a lot of problems that definitely make Prime 1 the better game, even though again, some parts have aged kind of poorly. For example, in this playthrough I haven't gone through the the mines yet, for example, so I definitely am not looking forward to that, because that is a huge difficulty spike with the complete lack of saving in a large portion of the phase on mines. This is definitely a good showcase of the spring ball. It definitely trivializes a lot of morph ball jumps, which I like personally as someone who's always been bad at timing those. I definitely like being able to simply tap X in this controller setup or shake the controller with other setups and circumvent a lot of the challenges, like so. In general, I definitely would recommend this version. Obviously, one issue with it is its price, given that the Trilogy on Wii, for example, or Wii U specifically as a digital download before it was delisted, was only about $20, and this remaster starts at about $40, but given the amount of work that's gone into it, and frankly, just how good the game is to begin with, I wouldn't necessarily argue with that price. I definitely wish it had been a little bit lower, like 30 almost feels like it would have been a sweet spot, but I would not be opposed to paying full price for this release because it's a budget title. I do wish it had also come with Prime 2 and 3, though it's rumored those might be coming at a later time, but potentially with less work put into them, unfortunately. We'll have to see how that goes. Maybe by the time of the next Direct, we'll have a clear idea of what's happening with both Prime 4 and potential remasters of these games. One of the other major issues with this collection or this release was actually the credits of it, because like a lot of Nintendo games in this generation, the credits are basically kept to the same length as the originals. So basically to do that, they credit the new staff and simply throw in a blurb thanking the original team. It's kind of interesting to me, given that this has been the case for a lot of games. I know some others where New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe and Pikmin 3 Deluxe, for example, where they basically just thank the original staff very quickly, but it really only got attention with Prime, and I find that really interesting actually. I feel like it's probably because in a lot of cases these other games have mostly Japanese developers, so even if they were complaining about it, we might not hear about it as much because of the language barrier. In general though, I do wish they had kept both sets of credits. I definitely think I would be willing to sit through more like 8 to 10 minutes of credits if it meant thanking everyone. Though to be fair, a lot of times when remasters do credit everybody, people also complain about the credits being too long, so in some ways I get why a company would want to keep the credits as short as possible, but again, I definitely would prefer sitting through more credits if it meant actually thanking everybody involved. Another downside of Prime Remastered is you have certain aspects that haven't been changed. For example, the artifact quest is still intact, meaning if you didn't like having to go around the entire world again to look for all these, you still have to do this in Remastered, unfortunately. Personally, I never really minded it, but I also don't mind backtracking that much in games. A lot of games that do have excessive backtracking, I admit it is a problem, but also I personally don't mind it too much. In this case, I feel like Metroid Prime 2 does it worse, so again, I'm curious to see how people feel about Prime 2 whenever that eventually gets a re-release. It's been very interesting seeing people going through a game like Prime Remastered for the first time. Having played the GameCube version first, it is really impressive to me how much they've managed to overhaul, but in a lot of ways, it does feel a little bit dated in terms of the overall core design of it. In general, again, I wish they had streamlined a few things, kind of like what they did with Wind Waker HD, where they cut down a bit of the Triforce quest. I definitely wish they had simplified a few things, but again, I definitely feel like they were also striving for accuracy with this release. But again, here's another example of just how much the Spring Ball can completely break certain sequences. This also applies to the Wii version as well. But yeah, this energy tank here is an absolute breeze to get with the Spring Ball. With that, we should be at the entrance of Phendrana, actually, one of the most popular areas, so let's head there too. Maybe it's just me because I haven't played the Wii version since my Let's Play actually, but I feel like the load times are a lot better in this version compared to that version. I do remember the trilogy was criticized for having a lot of load time issues. Also worth mentioning, from what I gather, certain graphical effects were also restored in terms of like the charge shots. So for example, with certain beams, the arm cannon would actually change a bit, and that was actually absent in the Wii version. So from what I gather, that has been restored. There are a couple of issues with mirrors, for example, where you can't see Samus's reflection. There's one famous scan commenting on how shiny a mirror is, and it's really awkward in this version not actually being able to see your reflection as a result. There are also some instances of lighting being missing in a few scenes, but overall, I do think the graphical overhaul is incredibly good throughout this entire game. Like, if you showed this to someone without telling them that this is essentially a 2002 GameCube game at heart, I wonder if they'd be able to guess, like, what they would say as a guess for how old this game is. Because this definitely looks very modern and incredibly impressive for, again, just a remake of an older game. It's definitely one that's caused a lot of buzz in terms of debating the merits of a remaster versus a remake. By definition, it's more of a remaster, given that it's heavily based off of the trilogy version, instead of being made from the ground up, like a lot of remakes are. But again, it's gotten so much work done to it that it almost feels like a lot of remakes. Again, I highly recommend playing this game, to be honest, if you haven't already. If you have played older versions and want to re-experience it, this is definitely the best way to go because of having more controller options as well. I also wanted to mention that I remember when I did my original playthrough, I actually had a goal to go through the entire series, or the Prime series specifically, before Prime 4 came out. And I never went through Echoes or Corruption, and the reason for that was actually because of this game, in a way. Because the trilogy was rumored at the time for a Switch port, I held off, and then years dragged on, and then eventually we got this, and we're still waiting for Echoes and Corruption. Maybe someday I'll redo my Prime playthrough and then go through the entire series, probably when we actually have a concrete release date for Prime 4, if I'm still doing videos by that point, because who knows how long it's actually going to take. But again, I would like to go through this game again for a playthrough, given that my old playthrough was like 2017 or something ridiculously long ago. Like, I want to say it was right after Prime 4 and Samus Returns both got announced, or around that time. So probably around 2017 to 2018. So yeah, I think it's about time to actually update my playthrough on this again, assuming I'm still doing Let's Plays by the time Prime 4 comes out, which is not necessarily a given with this game's development cycle, and Metroid in general, really. Like, look how long Dread took to come out in a tangible form, given that it was in planning stages for so long, and then basically they couldn't get the concepts to work out the way they wanted to on older hardware, and also they needed to find a proper developer, which they eventually did. Again, I do like the Metroid series. I think because I started with these, I do have a soft spot for Prime specifically, more so than the 2D games, which I played a lot later. Like Super Metroid, I think I played around 2014 or 2015, so I played it a long time after Prime 1 and 3. Echoes I actually played around 2012, I'm pretty sure. So I think I actually played these really out of order, because I want to say I played Echoes around 2011-ish, maybe even 2010. Either way, I do like these games a lot. Again, I really hope we do get some kind of re-release of 2 and 3, even if it isn't as impressive, though to be fair, 2 actually does have a lot of reused assets from 1, so maybe it will look pretty okay, but again, time will tell. Time will tell of what we'll actually get with the rest of these games, and with Prime 4. But with that being said, that was a quick look at Metroid Prime Remastered. Again, I would recommend this version of the game specifically because it's a lot easier to control than any other version of the game, and also it just looks incredibly pretty, especially given the game's core age. But with that being said, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join me next time for another discussion.